Hey, so welcome to my second AP US Notes video, Chapter 2, Transplantation, covering the years 1600 to 1685, by me, Kellen Mark. So, transplantation starts off by talking about French colonization in the New World, particularly Canada, New England area. They settled along the St. Lawrence River, which feeds from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. Um, their economy was based along the fur trade with the Native Americans, and the Native Americans were not only trading partners with the French, but they frequently intermingled and intermarried and became integral parts of each other's society. And the French began exploring the interior of North America, which really freaked the British out and caused the British to found areas like the Chesapeake Colony. The Chesapeake Colony was founded by the Virginia Company, which was a joint stock company, which is basically a collaboration of merchants put together by the King of England to sell shares over to investors to pay for the colonization efforts. The first attempt at the Chesapeake was Jamestown, which was a horrible failure. In Jamestown, they were subject to draconian laws known as laws divine, moral, and martial. These were heavily draconian, enforcing harsh punishments onto minor infractions, and began to discourage immigration, so they were later repealed. They also utilized the headright system, which awarded 50 acres to anyone that could afford, to anyone that paid for their own passage across the Atlantic over to the Virginia colony, and gave an extra 50 acres for every person that came with them. And so the book continues on to talk about the events of the year 1619. 1619 is significant, one, because it was the first year that the Virginia Company transplanted women over to the New World. B, it was the year that the first slaves were imported from Africa over to Virginia. And 3, it was the founding of the House of Burgesses, which replaced the laws divine, moral, and martial, and was the first self-governing body in the Americas. Oh, English Americas. So, the Chesapeake colonies began to come into conflict with Powhatan, this guy, Pocahontas' father. At first, the relationship between the colonists and the Powhatan tribe were relatively amicable, but after a series of raids by the colonists, led by John Smith, you remember him from Pocahontas, along with Powhatan, they began to have a long drawn out war that was only stopped when Pocahontas, the main character of Pocahontas, and Powhatan's daughter, married an English settler named John Smith and moved to England. This gave the Powhatans a strong bond with the colonists, and hostilities ceased until Powhatan and Pocahontas' deaths and the takeover of Powhatan's brother of the Powhatan tribe. Now, another thing about the Virginia colonies, tobacco was an extremely, you can't understate this, extremely integral part of the Virginia colony. It began as an expensive luxury, that started in Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, and it was eventually somehow transported to Virginia, and it yielded a very, very high profit, making it really lucrative for the settlers to produce. It basically consumed the colony, and they produced so much tobacco that it actually lowered the value of tobacco on the European market, and they responded simply with basic inflation of flooding with more tobacco, so they would still have profits. This led to a system of hiring indentured servants to work on the plantations because of the cheap, accessible labor. Indentured servants were usually orphans, criminals, or the unemployed from England, Scotland, and Ireland. They were cheap labor and had to work in inhumanely poor conditions. They were frequently mistreated, and you could even argue that it was a precursor to slavery, which would be very well established in the area later. And even though, unlike slavery, indentured servitude was for a limited amount of time, the vast majority of indentured servants stayed poor for their entire lives. All right, so the book begins to move north to the Maryland colony, which was a preparatory colony of George Calvert. A preparatory colony, I should explain first, is a privately owned colony, usually by a businessman or a noble. It was founded mainly for Catholics, which in England were a persecuted minority, but unfortunately for Calvert, Protestants began moving into Maryland instead of the intended Catholics, and this led to a lot of tension between Protestants and Catholics, even though there was more tension between the two different groups of settlers than between settlers and Native Americans. But this did lead to the Act for Religious Toleration in 1649, which granted complete religious freedom in the colony and was the first doctrine of the such in North America. So we begin to go further north into New England, where starting out with the Pilgrims. Now, just for clarity's sake, I made up a chart. So they're all Christians are either Catholic or Protestants. Protestants are divided into several different subgroups. We're focusing on the Anglicans right now. These aren't important. And of the Anglicans, we're looking at the Puritans, who believed that even though Anglicanism was a Protestant religion, it retained too much of Catholic practices. So there were groups of separatists, of whom are the famous Pilgrims, who landed at Plymouth Rock. They actually began they were the first self-governing colony in North America with the signing of the Mayflower Compact, which basically put them under the sovereignty of the English king, but gave them the rights to govern themselves, and all adult males present there signed it. The Plymouth colony was at first extremely unsuccessful. They were dying in droves, and half of them were dead after the first winter. But because of two Native Americans of the Wampanoag tribe, named Samoset and Squanto, the Pilgrims ended up surviving because of the techniques that they were taught by the Samoset and Squanto, and this led to the practice of Thanksgiving after their first harvest, which, as you know, we celebrate today. So, the Plymouth colony eventually got eclipsed by the much larger Massachusetts Bay colony, even further north, founded by John Winthrop, who was also a Puritan, but the important thing to remember is that he was not a separatist. The colony at first consisted of about 1,000 people. It was extremely conservative, but extremely prosperous prosperous, and peaceful, except for its relationships with Native Americans, which is shown when it was at first peaceful until English settlers from the Connecticut River Valley started encroaching into Native American, namely Pequot lands, and this started an extremely bloody but fast war between the English settlers and the Pequot Native Americans. The Pequots were utterly annihilated by the English, and those who were killed were sold into slavery to the West Indies. Now, the colony of Rhode Island was started by Roger Williams, who was a Puritan dissident, and he was a dissident because he challenged the Puritan teachings in the Massachusetts colony and eventually had to flee into the interior of what is now Rhode Island and founded what's now the capital of Providence. Another Puritan dissident was Annie Hutchinson, who was even more considered more extreme than Williams because she was a woman and preached to women and to a combined congregation of women and men, which was unheard of at the time and completely crazy to the Puritans. Of course, she and her followers also had to escape to Rhode Island. Now, South Carolina was founded by, as a proprietary colony also. It began to have It began to start out unsuccessfully until they started producing rice. Rice quickly became the equivalent, South Carolina's equivalent to tobacco in Virginia. And in order to farm all this rice and other goods in Virginia and other colonies, they had to import slaves from North Africa. Now, I covered slaves in the last chapter in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, but I never got to talk about slave culture. So, English slavery started in the Caribbean colonies on sugar plantations, and it later spread onto the mainland. Slave culture was mostly the attempted preservation of African traditions and ideals in these new environments, and one important thing to remember is that slaves were often more numerous than whites. Now, we move on to the Pennsylvania colony, which was started by a Quaker named William Penn, who was, the king was indebted to his father, and he's decided to start this new colony based around the ideals of religious freedom and equality, which basically failed. And so now I want to talk about Alright, so New York was originally settled by the Dutch as New Netherlands. During one of the frequent conflicts between the English and the Dutch, New Netherlands was captured and given to the Duke of York and became New York. It was back then what it is now, an extremely diverse, divided group, but somehow managed to make it in hegemony. And to answer the chapter question, life in New England was very religious, family-oriented. The New England colonies had a mixed economy, so they wouldn't be affected by as affected as Virginia would be by an economic crisis, and they were extremely urban compared to Virginia, which was rural. Their sole crop was tobacco, which required the use of indentured servants and slaves. It was mostly single men instead of families, and was based on economics. So that's it for tonight. Hope you enjoyed the American history lesson.